Oh, she knows. I did not call on someone to lead prayer, so I'm either going to do it or somebody can volunteer to do it. That's not an ultimatum, just an opportunity. All right, Russ says he'll do it for us. Thank you. So, I forgot my piece of paper. Um, I do have one prayer request. Um, I received an email from a brother worship at the Tuscumbia Church of Christ in Tuscumbia, Alabama. He's been a missionary in Ukraine for like 3 decades or something, and he was requesting that churches of Christ pray for Ukraine on May the 4th. So I've got that. I've got all the information on that. We'll share at the appropriate time during the worship service. But of course, that's that's a request we're happy to honor, to pray for the situation with Russia and Ukraine, and particularly pray for those Christians who are caught up in that conflict. We read Revelation and we feel like it's a foreign a foreign thing, but there are people in the world today who are going through very similar kinds of trials. So I'll pray for that situation. What other requests do we have this morning? Frank? Okay. So Adam had a long trip in the car, or a long round trip in the car yesterday from Tennessee. So with his back and neck challenges he's already got, those are aggravated today. So pray for Adam Cash. Yes, Alan. Okay. Alan Marsh is dealing with some back issues as well. Yes, Kathy. Okay. Kathy Thorpe's going to have heart cath on both sides on Tuesday. Other items we'd like to include in the prayer, requests, thanksgivings, etc. All right. If there is not anything else, then I will turn it over to Russ. All right. Revelation. What's it about? You got it. You got it. Now, is this thing going to work? We're going to do a brief review here, and then we'll look at chapters 15 and 16. We mentioned here a couple of weeks ago this six spiral vision, six cycles that overlap with each other, as you can see on the screen. And we said there when we first introduced this, we were at the beginning of chapter 12. There's some who read chapters 12 through 20 or so as basically an extended judgment on Rome, and we talked about that a little bit last week, and we'll talk a little bit more about last week's discussion in just a moment. But just to remind us where we are in the course of the book, today we're looking at chapter 15 and chapter 16. So that puts us in the end of the unnumbered visions as they're labeled here, from chapter 12 to 15, and then the beginning of the seven plagues. And really, this is a little bit artificial, and here's what I mean. There's no question when you read the book of Revelation that there are cycles. And we do our best at times to break them down in a very easy to digest manner like they are on the screen. Some of these are clearer, though, than others, because we're going to look today at the seven plagues. Where do the seven plagues end is an open-ended question. And what I mean by that is something you'll see. The first six bowls of wrath that are poured out as plagues are clearly defined. But commentators disagree about the seventh one. Where does it end? I think we can agree where it begins, but where does it end? On this slide, and I'm drawing from multiple resources, the suggestion is that the seventh one goes through the end of chapter 19, or at least the better part of chapter 19. I think the reason for that is something we'll get to in a moment. Try not to get ahead of myself here. There's too many streams of information flowing. Nevertheless, if you look at another resource, and you might see them saying that the seventh plague is just through the end of chapter 16. So that's not to be confusing, but to say that we're doing our best to understand the way that these visions unfold and how they relate to each other. And sometimes we may not even agree on the exact end point in particular on some of these. In any case, today, we're looking at a scene in chapter 15, verses 1 through 4. You see at the bottom, of celebratory worship that tells us that we're at the end of a cycle, and then we start a new cycle at 15 verse 5, which is the introduction of these seven plagues. That's what we're doing together this morning, and so before we do that, though, we're going to review. We said there are three main cycles of judgment in Revelation, and each one of these is broken up between the sixth and seventh piece by an interlude. So we saw first the seal, the scroll with seven seals, and the first six seals are opened, and then there is an interlude before the seventh seal is opened. And then we saw the seven trumpets, in which again you have six, and then a break, and then the seventh. And today we're looking at these seven bowls, and the interlude comes in verses 13 through 16. And it's in that interlude that one of the most notorious elements of the book of Revelation appears. The battle of Armageddon. Well, time won't allow us to go into great detail on that, but I do have something y'all help me remember. I've brought a book with me most weeks with the intention of reading a sentence or two, and most weeks I get ahead of myself or I get beyond and I forget. But it's really important that we address at least a couple of little things about Armageddon today, and that book has some good information about it. Frank covered last week chapters 13 and 14. I thought he did a great job. I was able to hear the recording. And he can also tell you that the books that have been placed in the library are very valuable for the study of Revelation. So I want you to be aware of those and take advantage of them. In reviewing, I'm not in any way questioning Frank's breakdown of this material, but just as a way of bringing us into 15 and 16. So you can see there on the screen, I'm not going to go over all of this in great detail, But we have the introduction of some individuals in chapter 13, the first and second beast. And as was mentioned in your class, what seemed the most reasonable based on everything that we can see about the details of these individuals, the first beast is a representative of the Roman emperor. As was mentioned in class, the Emperor Nero was thought by some to have been resurrected, and this, what do you want to call it, a myth? That's the way it's referred to in classical literature, the Nero Redivivus myth, the revived Nero myth. Whatever you want to call it, some thought that Domitian was either the embodiment of Nero or that Nero was lurking in the shadows, having been revived. Some of that imagery appears in this description of this beast. And there is an idea here that this beast is under the influence of the dragon, Satan, and is persecuting Christians from a place of power. You talked about the 10 horns. The 10 horns, horn being representative of power or authority. And you mentioned there was a question about the meaning of the numbers last week. So the number 7 is completeness, wholeness, totality, heaven and earth combined. The number 10 also represents a whole, complete number. Now remember, represents. The number doesn't stand for anything numerically speaking. So 10 is just a number of completion or fullness. Okay, so this would be that this individual his power is not divided. You see what I'm saying? Okay. So I think you may have even mentioned last week, if you go back to Alexander had these 3 generals, and his empire was divided. But by the time of the late 1st century, Roman emperors have almost total power. And so the generals answer to them, the Senate answers to them. Now, that's not the way that Rome was originally conceived, but especially when you get further and further from the epicenter, from the capital, individuals view the emperor as all-encompassing. And so you have this Roman emperor, the number 666 can be construed to represent the name Nero. Nobody really knows, but that's the best guess I've seen. And then the second beast seems to be working alongside the first one and enforcing the works of the first one. And so this seems to be representative of those individuals, particularly outside of Rome, who were enforcing worship of the emperor as a way of keeping these individuals, as in Asia Minor, submissive to the Roman emperor. So if you're worshiping the emperor, you're not going to try to defect from the empire. Frank? Yes, yes, yes. 7 is a more spiritually complete number. Is a good way of thinking about it. These are all representations, images, metaphors, however you want to phrase it. 7 and 10 are not the same. 7 usually appears in a more spiritual capacity, but not always. So, but yes. Did you have something to add? Perhaps. Yeah, yeah. So I think that 7, I don't want to get too far down this rabbit trail, but 7 is the perfect number. But perfect in the Bible doesn't mean necessarily without flaw, does it? What does perfect in the Bible typically mean? Yeah, so, we're told that in 2 Timothy 3:16 to 17 that Scripture is given that the man of God may be perfect, equipped for every good work. Perfect means having reached the state that God desires for us. That doesn't mean in this life that we're without flaw or sin, right? Okay, so there's a spiritual maturity in that case. Or in James 1:2-4, we're told that we are to rejoice in our trials because they lead to being made perfect and complete. So this is the 7 being the perfect number means that it achieves the design purpose of God. Okay, 10 being a full number, it's not. And so there's a similarity, but there may be a nuance of difference, and maybe for our sake, trying to pinpoint that ends up being an exercise in futility. But in any case, you have the second beast, and then in chapter 14, you have this gathering of God's faithful people. The number 144,000 representative of God's faithful people, and I would say that it's possible that we could see that as faithful people, Jew and Gentile alike. 12 times 12, so 12,000 times 12,000 times, okay, or 12 times 12 times 100. You get there, right? So 12 from the old, 12 from the new, representative of all of God's people. And so they are gathered together and they are assembled to worship because they're faithful. They declare what is true, the text says, so they are not blaspheming, which is the contrast, right? This is in the situation of persecution and idolatry. These are not ones who are proclaiming false names or false teachings, but they're wholly faithful to God. There's an announcement of judgment from three angels in 14, 6 through 11. So you've heard, woe, woe, Babylon has fallen. Okay. And then the judgment is enacted, represented as a reaping of the earth, a sickle reaching down and swiping through the earth. Okay. Within that, there are a couple of positives, and one is twice. Here's a call for endurance of the saints. And then there's a blessing. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord, Revelation 14:13. So, just a brief overview. You got all of that in some form or fashion last week, but it sets us up for this week because we're coming to the close of this cycle in chapter 15, verses 1 through 4, where we see another of these themes of celebratory praise. And so that's where we are now. So, before I go any further, what did you recognize? If you read this week, what did you recognize in chapters 15 and 16? Frank? Yes. Yes. Very good. So Frank mentions, and I'm going to have to click quickly because I don't have a way to select individual slides. But one thing that Frank mentioned is this is not a chronological sequence. That's one of the really big barriers. It's not the only barrier that we have in reading Revelation, but if we were to read something written in the modern day, we sort of expect it to follow a linear timeline. It starts here, and unless, we're given clues that this is a flashback, for example, in a modern piece of literature, we expect things to proceed from 8 o'clock a.m. to 8 o'clock p.m. Boom, 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 right? But that's not the way that Revelation is designed, and it's not the way that many older works of literature, ancient works of literature were designed. And it's clear, in spite of all of the window dressing and imagery that we have in Revelation, it's impossible to look at what's going on and say, this is happening in order because, well, a third of the earth is dead. A third of the sun is gone. Well, number one, we've misunderstood the nature of image if we think that's literal. But number two, how can that be if later you see these other things? So it's clear that we've got some imagery, but we've also got some stuff. What's going on with the timeline? Don't try to pin it down as a single line. You've got interwoven loops. Okay, so you sort of start here, and then you find you're back here, and then you're over here, and that's really confusing for us. That's really confusing for us. But something that also helps us, if we think that God is giving us a blueprint for things to come, and then we expect that we can follow these things in order, we're going to be sorely mistaken. So don't get caught up on the timing of things when you read Revelation, because if you do, it's confusing enough already, and then you start trying to apply a linear matrix to it, a linear standard of time, and you're just going to end up in the wrong place. And that's not me being arrogant, because I don't claim to have it all figured out or understood, but I'm just saying that's not the way you read this kind of literature. So, yes, good. Frank says It's not in chronological order. Let's not read it as though it is. We're going to end up being more confused than helped. What else did you recognize? Alan? Yes, yes. There's a strong throughout this section, not just right here in these two chapters, but throughout this section, starting at chapter 12. There's a lot of allusion, and there's some more elsewhere in the book, to Moses and the plagues. Even someone asked me after class when we looked at chapter 12 a couple of weeks ago, they said, that flood of water that helped God's people, was that the flood with Noah? And I said, no, it's not. I think it's probably better to think of it in terms of the Exodus and how water actually helps God's people in the Exodus. You remember what happens? God divides the waters, and Moses strikes the waters with the staff. They divide. They go over on dry land, and then the water sweeps away their enemies. So it's not it's an image, but that's a more likely parallel. But here, definitely. And we already saw with the trumpet blasts, didn't we? There were some strong parallels with the plague. What's the difference, since you have now read the trumpets and the bowls, what is the difference between the trumpets and the bowls? Since they share quite a bit of overlap, do you notice anything different between them? Okay, good. So the trumpets are an opportunity to repent, right? The bowls seem to be more final judgment, more final. That is, the opportunity to repent has passed, and look back at the trumpets and see it was a portion of the sea, a portion of the earth, a portion of this, and sometimes it gives a third or a fourth or whatever. But here, you don't see that. You see all of the seas, all of the fresh water. Okay, so it's a sort of, I think we used the word before, intensification, that these grow in intensity. And so there is definitely more a sense of this being more final. Okay, I had Jennifer and then Alan. Yes, so she brought up the Sea of Glass. We're going to come back to that in just a moment. There's a really cool detail that's been pointed out to me in various books that I want to share with you all. Alan? Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Completely unrepentant at this point. Good. Anything else that you recognize? Okay. So time's not going to permit us to go into great detail on any of this, and I apologize. But I do want to point out some important details. Number one, the Sea of Glass that appears in chapter 15, verse 2. You'll recall that we talked back in chapter 4 about the Sea of Glass that surround God's throne is at the center of this Sea of Glass. And you remember we talked about some of the parallels with the temple. And in the temple, there was a sea. Do you remember that? There was a sea in the temple. It's referred to in another way. Does anybody remember how it's referred to in the temple? The bronze. Anybody ever heard this phrase? The bronze laver. What's a laver? Do what? Oh, well, okay, that's like a lathe with TH. Laver, laver. Anybody know? We use a word, these are Latin words. Lavatory, which is a sink. Okay? A lavatory is a sink. A laver is a bath. So this is a bathing place. I'm going through my daily Bible reading, and remember that First and Second Chronicles will retell what you read in First and Second Kings, basically. In the building of the temple, they build this huge, it's massive. It holds like 18,000 gallons of water. I looked this up. The average in-ground swimming pool, not Olympic size, but like in a residential house, is like 10 to 30,000 gallons of water. So this bath in the temple holds 18,000 gallons of water. It's made out of bronze. It's seated atop of the backs of four sculpted bulls. And the priests get in this water and they bathe before and after they offer sacrifices. So it is something they pass through in order to enter the presence of God. So in chapter 4 and verse 6, we're told that the throne of God is surrounded by this sea of glass. And in chapter 4 and verse 6, the people are separated from God by the sea. But here in chapter 15, the sea of glass is fiery, and there are different interpretations of why it's fiery. But you'll notice that God's people are now standing on the sea. So they are getting closer to the presence of God. That's a very fascinating detail. Now, remember what we've said in our study of the book and trying to get better at understanding it. When the book interprets something for us, we should notice that. But also when we see parallels to details that are already in the book. So here we've got a recurring detail, the sea of glass. There's a change. Now it looks like fire. But also the change is God's people are now drawing closer to Him. What does that mean? Well, does it mean that they have... you've got to go back and look at the context of chapter 4 and the context of chapter 15. Does it mean that they've died and now they're coming into His presence? Does it mean that the timeline of history is such that we're drawing closer to the end? There are different ways we can interpret it, but it is a fascinating detail we shouldn't overlook. All right. The Song of Moses is referenced in chapter 15, verse 3. The Song of Moses appears in Exodus 15, and in Exodus 15, it's all about God vanquishing His enemies. But the song that is sung in Revelation 15 is about giving glory to God and drawing all nations to Himself. So this is not the song only of Moses, it is also the song of the Lamb. So you combine what you see in Exodus 15, God is able to defeat His enemies, with the work of the Lamb, which is to draw all people to God. So what is God's preference? That people be destroyed because they won't worship Him, they won't acknowledge Him, or they be saved through His Son? Right, of course, we know His preference. But He allows free will, and so this song is a song of Moses and the Lamb. We've already seen, and we're going to see more, God defeats His enemies, but there is also the faithful witness of His people that is hopefully drawing people in through the work of the Lamb. And so this is a song it's not just the song of Moses, it's the song of Moses and the Lamb. And instead of emphasizing God destroying the wicked, it emphasizes God saving. It emphasizes God saving the wicked. And we see the tabernacle language that appears in verses 5 to 8. Now, earlier we saw the temple. Now, we could make too much of this, but in the Old Testament, what is the tabernacle to the temple? Precursor, predecessor, right? Tabernacle comes first. Now you could say here, in this case, that we're drawing on all of this Exodus, all of this Moses, time of Moses language, and it makes sense since we're drawing on that to use a tabernacle instead of the temple because the tabernacle was erected during the days of Moses. But also later in the book, we're going to see a new temple. So if we're looking for any kind of chronology, that may be noteworthy. Okay, so we've got this tabernacle. The details that are given draw on the details of the construction of the tabernacle, which appear in Exodus 35 through 40. But I want you to notice one verse, and it's in Exodus 40, verse 38. Exodus 40, verse 38. There's a strong parallel with that verse and what appears in Revelation 15, verse 8. So if you got your Bibles open already to Revelation, keep your finger in Revelation, but go back to Exodus. And I said verse 38, but I think we might be a verse or two off. I have to pull it up. I know it's near the end. This is the very end of the book of Exodus. My pages are sticky. Funny how they don't do that at my desk. All right, it's 40 verse 35. So somebody read for us Exodus 40 verse 35. It says, the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. What does Revelation 15 verse 8 say? Okay, sound similar? Moses is not able to enter because of the cloud. The glory of the Lord fills the tabernacle. Verse 8 says the sanctuary is filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no one could enter until the seven plagues and the seven angels were finished. So, obvious that this imagery draws on the tabernacle imagery that we have, the glory of the Lord, a representative of his presence in some way, his overwhelming presence. We also have this description, I'm sorry I'm moving so fast, but we also have this description of the angels. They're wearing linen clothing, they have sashes. A lot of this sounds a lot like the prescribed clothing for the priest that appears in Leviticus, or Exodus rather, chapter 28. All right. Anything you want to say about chapter 15 before we move on to chapter 16? I have two divisions in chapter 15. I didn't show them on this slide, but remember that 15:1 through 4 is one of these scenes of celebratory worship. That's the 144,000 gathered to worship, and then we have 144,000 is chapter 14. I got behind. But we have this celebratory scene of worship in 15:1 through 4, and then we have what is basically the introduction to the seven bowls of wrath in verses 5 through 8. Okay. All right, chapter 16. A lot. And we're just going to rush through it. But I put it all on the screen because I knew if I walked through them one by one, we would never get done on time. This reminds me of all that we have to cover. We already said that there's some similarities with the previous set of seven, the trumpets, and the set before that, the seals. A couple of things that you'll notice is the totality that you have in these that we already mentioned. The first four are nature-based. Does that sound familiar? We said, and we've even said 4 is that earthly number, so it sort of makes sense. Starting in the fifth one, though, there seems to be a stronger emphasis on the impact or the effects upon human beings. And so we have a new wrinkle with the fifth bowl, and that is that we're told that the kingdom, the throne, is going to be covered in darkness, and people are going to be wailing, they're going to be gnawing on their tongues, just in great pain and suffering. And then the sixth one is not to be overlooked. The sixth bowl being the drying up of the Euphrates River. So I don't claim to be a history buff or really, really great at looking at maps and all of that. But Euphrates River, what is it? Anybody know? Modern day Iraq, Babylon, right? So it feeds Babylon. Now Babylon is an image in this chapter, right? So Euphrates, does it literally represent the river Euphrates, or is it also an image? Yeah. So I think it's probably an image more than a literal representation. But what the Euphrates did for Babylon was create a natural barrier against enemies. You're in the ancient world. You don't have modern technologies. The places that thrived were the places that had natural barriers. So remember Edom. Edom was protected because they were sort of like in this valley up on a mountain. It was really hard to get to them and attack them. Okay? So the drying up of the Euphrates would have opened up the way for enemies to attack. And so the drying up of the Euphrates is opening up the way for the destruction that's going to come with this seventh bowl. Babylon, being representative of Rome, is going to be destroyed. So in the interlude, and this is the part that people really get hung up on, so I knew we have to address it at least for a moment. In the interlude, in chapter 16, we get the dreaded Armageddon. And this is what the text says there, beginning of verse 13. And we know that this is an interlude in part because we have one of these key phrases, and I saw. So this tells us, okay, there's something being added to the vision. And I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits like frogs. Okay, frogs were just considered not great. I don't understand all that culturally, but also think about the connection that we've seen already with Moses and the plagues. So frogs were one of the plagues. So, for they are demonic spirits performing signs who go abroad to the kings of the whole world to assemble them for battle on the great day of God, the Almighty. Behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake, keeping his garments on, that he may not go about naked and be seen exposed. And they assembled them at the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. Now, nothing else is said here about Armageddon. The parallel that comes up is in chapter 19. The word Armageddon does not appear in chapter 19, but it's obvious from the context of chapter 19 that we're referring to the same event or series of events. And in chapter 19, there's no great description of this battle. Basically, chapter 19 says everybody's assembled and the enemies of God are defeated. And it goes from everybody's here to God wins. Now, does that mean that there is no struggle in the in-between? Well, not necessarily. But that's not the point of the revelation, to describe that struggle in that case. So all of the things that people have imagined about Armageddon, they didn't get them from Revelation because there are no details. All we've got is they assembled. That's told here, and it's retold in chapter 19, and then they're defeated. But what does that look like? Now, what's been brought up, and this is where I brought the book with me, because he can say it better than I can. What's been brought up is, first, have you seen any Jewish names, any Hebrew names in the book of Revelation before this? Have you seen any names from the Old Testament being used in the book of Revelation before this point? What about in the most familiar portion of Revelation, chapters 2 and 3, the letters to the churches? Do any names from the Old Testament appear? Balak, Balaam, all right? Balaam. What about Jezebel? Yep. Okay. What about later? We hear this city where the lamb is slain, referred to as Sodom. Okay. So far, and that's not an exhaustive listing. When the Lord refers to Balaam in the letters to the churches in Revelation 2 and 3, is he talking about the prophet Balaam who caused God's people to commit idolatry and fornication? Is he talking about that prophet having been resurrected and actually appearing in Asia Minor in the first century? When he talks about Jezebel being thrown on a bed of affliction, is he talking about the evil queen who was the son of Ethbaal, who was a worshiper of Baal? Is he talking about her being resurrected and living among Christians in Asia Minor in the first century? When he calls Jerusalem, he doesn't use the word Jerusalem. When he calls Jerusalem Sodom, is he literally saying that Jerusalem has transformed into the city of Sodom from the book of Genesis? So far, have we seen a single occurrence in the book of Revelation where a name from the Old Testament is literal? No, we haven't. And the exhaustive listing is in this book and others. When we get to chapter 16, all of a sudden individuals want to say that Armageddon, which is the valley of Megiddo, is a literal designation. That is, that there's going to be a literal battle in the literal valley of Megiddo, which would be in the modern-day Middle East. Does that follow with everything that we have read so far in the book of Revelation? It would be out of character at this point if throughout the first this many visions, all of these names from the Old Testament are representative of themes, but not literal details. That all of a sudden now we're gonna flip the coin and it's going to be literal instead of representative of a theme. So what do we know about the Valley of Megiddo? Well, again, we're not as up on our Old Testament history as we should be, and that includes me. So I'm going to read what he said. He says, Old Testament references to Megiddo often link it to battles in which adversaries of Israel are defeated. In Judges 5, Megiddo is associated with Deborah's victory over Israel's foes. Okay? In 2 Kings 9, an ally of Queen Jezebel, the opponent of the prophets, was wounded and then died at Megiddo. Later, King Josiah of Judah was killed near Megiddo. He was a good king in many respects, but he went into battle where he was killed because he refused to listen to the word of the Lord. In Zechariah 12, verse 11, there's an announcement of the coming day of the Lord's victory, mentioning Megiddo as the place where the worshippers of a Canaanite god mourn. Taken together, the association suggests that Megiddo is a place name that portends the coming destruction of the adversaries of God. So that is to say that in using this name, what is being represented is not a literal place. What is being represented is the fact that as God has done over and over again, he will defeat his enemies, which is exactly what we see when this battle is not really described, but simply shown as God winning in chapter 19. So I think it would be unfair to what we've seen in Revelation to take it as a literal place when we haven't seen any of these names, even Babylon, being used literally. All right, we've already gone over time, and I'm sorry I had to rush through all of that, but it was the only way I knew to discuss it. What message or messages of hope would the Christians in Asia Minor have taken from the vision so far? Victory in Christ. The power of the testimony. Power of the testimony, right? So they're going to cling to that testimony, even if it costs them their physical life. Anything else? Lord willing, we're going to talk about chapter 17 and 18 next week. Time is getting away from us. We've got just a few weeks left. Hope you feel like you're gaining something from this study. There's a lot we don't understand, but there's some that we can. And so I hope that we're moving in that direction. Coffee and donuts downstairs. We'll be back together at 11 for worship.